I've been hearing a lot of people talk about superhero fatigue, that Marvel is losing its audience, that Marvel is falling off a cliff with the MCU. The thing is, I don't like unsubstantiated claims, so I dove into the numbers and this is what I found. So the first thing I did was to pull the worldwide box office earnings for all the Marvel movies. And I wanted to put them into a graph so I can see the trends to try and figure out, how is Marvel trending right now? Are they trending up or are they trending down? But before I can look at the trends for the Marvel movies, there's one change I had to make to the dataset. When I was looking over the box office earnings, it was really evident that the Avengers movies are on a completely different level than the rest. You see, 4 of the top 5 highest grossing films are the 4 Avengers movies. And this makes sense. They are the big team-ups. They are completely different than the single hero story arcs. But the whole idea that Marvel is falling off a cliff, this superhero fatigue, has all started coming just recently. The last Avengers movie was 4 years ago. So to compare the recent trend, the recent movies with the Avengers, is going to be ridiculously skewed. That is bad data. So to compare apples to apples, I removed the Avengers movies from the dataset when looking at the trend. Don't worry, they'll be back later. But for now, I pulled together the rest of the single hero arc storylines to see the trend. Now I couldn't just look at a linear trend because the time up until Endgame is much longer than the recent movie time that we really want to analyze. The result being a linear trend would be skewed majorly because of what had happened before. So instead I chose to do a polynomial trend, and this is what I saw. Well, this graph is pretty cut and dry. The far right side, the most recent time period, it is trending down. Everything after the pandemic has a downward trend. So, case closed, right? Well, not so fast. You see, there's a couple of other things I noticed when I was looking into the data that I think needs to be considered when you're looking at what has been happening recently. And the first thing that I noticed when I was looking into the data is that there are some major similarities amongst movies in the same hero arc. Once a hero has their first solo film and establishes their baseline for their worldwide gross, each of their subsequent sequels has stayed fairly similar to what they established at the beginning. Now this graph here shows us the hero arcs and their movement through their sequels. And we can see that these lines are not jumping all over the place. For the most part, they're very consistent. There are a couple of jumps up and a couple of minor drops, but for the most part, they're a slow, steady incline through the sequels. And wherever the first one is, the rest follows suit. This is very important if we were to try and forecast forward, because now we have points of reference for each individual type of movie. If we're looking at a movie that is a sequel to a story arc that we had seen before, then we can use that as a baseline to figure out what we can expect from the next one. But before we go into forecasting movies forward, I do have one more thing I want to look at in the past. And for that, I needed to move the Avengers movies back into the dataset. When I add the Avengers movies back in, I see that they don't just boost their own revenue. The movies around the release of an Avengers film also tends to be higher than those who are further from an Avengers film. What this tells us is that the ramp up of an oncoming Avengers movie tends to give a boost to the movies right before it. And on the other end, just after an Avengers movie completes, the movies that follow also tend to have a bit of a boost. So this gives us another point of reference. When we're looking at how a movie performs, we can see how is it in relation to its time period compared to other Avengers movies. Does it happen before or after one? Or does it happen in the middle, during one of the low periods? And with all this information at our fingertips, this now gives us some solid baselines to look back at the recent Marvel movies and decide, are they underperforming, or are there reasons for how their performance has been? And the first movie I want to look at is the most recent Marvel movie, Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. And this one definitely dropped the ball. It has one of the worst performances ever for a Marvel movie. So what gives? Well, looking at the fact that Avengers movies boost the movies around them, there are two glaring exceptions to that finding. Just after Avengers: Age of Ultron, we have a movie that performs much lower than any of the movies around it. And that movie is Ant-Man. And the second example came just after Avengers: Infinity War, where, once again, the next movie performed much lower than any of the movies around it, failing to show that Avengers boost. And that movie was Ant-Man and the Wasp. These movies performed similarly to each other. They showed that consistency within themselves. The thing is, they were much lower than most of the other Marvel properties. And they shouldn't have been, given that they came on the heels of an Avengers movie. Seeing as they should have gotten a boost from being near an Avengers movie, if we remove that boost, if we lower their expected revenue for how they would have been if they were at one of the low points far from an Avengers movie, such as we saw with Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, then the revenue we saw from Quantumania really wasn't that unreasonable. It was 4 years after the last Avengers movie. It doesn't have that boost. And it's an Ant-Man film, which, looking at how the movies perform, that is not one of the more favorable hero lines, according to their box office earnings. So part of the reason for Quantumania's failure may not be superhero fatigue, it may not be failing of Marvel. It might just be that the Ant-Man storyline is not one that audiences are grasping onto like the rest of them. And without the Avengers boost to help it along, it fell flat. Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania was one of only 3 movies in the history of Marvel that has seen a decrease in their box office earnings from their predecessor. So when a sequel comes out, they have always outperformed the one before it with 3 exceptions. Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, Black Panther: Wakanda Forever, and Thor: Love and Thunder. Unfortunately, those are the 3 most recent movies, so could there be something significant there? Well, next I want to talk briefly about Black Panther: Wakanda Forever. And at first glance, it looks like you should be comparing Black Panther: Wakanda Forever to Black Panther. But that may not be the case. You see, the trend I saw was looking at a hero's story arc. But Black Panther: Wakanda Forever is a different hero. Same name, same environment, we're following Wakanda. But the Black Panther from the first movie is not the one we see in the second. We are now following the journey of a brand new hero. So it might be safe to say we should actually be comparing Black Panther: Wakanda Forever as a starting solo film instead of as a sequel. If we do that, it actually comes out above the average for Marvel movies. It would be one of the best performing solo starting films. And the last movie to talk about is Thor: Love and Thunder. And it's the smallest of the declines from the 3, but it is still a decline, and it is still concerning that we had 3 declines in a row most recently. And Thor Ragnarok was close to Avengers Infinity War in the timeline, so it should get a little bit of a boost there. Whereas Thor: Love and Thunder is far from an Avengers film. But does this give it an excuse to be a decline at all? The thing is, we can find reasons for each of the 3 most recent movies that saw that decline from their predecessor. But are they reasons, or are they excuses? I feel like we are still too new. There's not enough data to know for sure. So the next thing I want to do is to forecast forward the upcoming Marvel movies and try and set baselines for what we can expect those to earn. And then we'll know when they come. If they meet those projections, then Marvel can get back on track. But if they fall short, then I think it'll prove once and for all that Marvel is heading in the wrong direction. Now, the first of these I want to forecast is Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, which comes out very soon. And this is one that we definitely have some data that we can support. Now, the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie came out near an Avengers movie, but Volume 2 did not. It happened right in the middle, right in that low point. So there's a great comparison for what we're seeing now with Volume 3. Well, the increase from Guardians of the Galaxy to Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 saw about a 12.7% increase in their worldwide box office revenue. And since the second and the third are both coming out in the low periods, we kind of don't need to look at that factor. So if we look at the performance of the past Guardians movies and project forward a similar growth rate of 12.7%, that gives us about $980 million as our expected box office pull from Volume 3. On the other hand, if the downward trend continues and we really are seeing Marvel on the decline, we could see about a 25% decrease from Volumes 2 to 3. And this would put us at about $650 million for the box office revenue. And our upper bound would be if this movie took off and we saw growth more similar to the other Marvel sequels at about 30% growth. This would put the movie at about $1.1 billion, or a little above that. So this gives us an expected range of about $980 million, a lower bound of $650 million, and an upper bound of about $1.1 billion. And this would tell us a lot of information depending on where in that range this movie falls. If it falls on the lower side, that downward trend will continue. But if it even just meets its projection, if it meets the 12.7%, that's enough to move that forecast back in a positive direction. Now, a little later this year, we're going to see another Marvel movie in The Marvels. Now, this one comes after Captain Marvel in her story arc. Well, that movie performed a little over 1.1 billion itself. So that's a great starting point. The thing is, that movie came just before Avengers Endgame. And so it was boosted by the biggest Marvel movie yet. So we have to take that into consideration when we're looking at a forecast forward. If this movie manages to at least keep up to some extent with its past movie, with a slight decline due to it being at a low point rather than right next to a Marvel movie, it could still fall around $1 billion, which would be a great pull for Marvel and still move towards that upward trend. If we see a decline, that would put this one around 850 million. And if we see an increase, on track with the other Marvel movies, it could get as high as 1.5 billion. So there are some high expectations from this movie if we were to look back at past performance and carry those forward. So at this point, it really could go either way. The trend recently is downward, but it's with films that we would have expected them to pull a little lower than they had in the past. Whereas Guardians of the Galaxy isn't in the same boat. This is a more cut and dry one where we can see where these numbers should be moving. And the Marvels as well. The Marvels, we should see a large box office pull. So if these two movies also underperform, then I think that's the final nail in the coffin to show that Marvel is trending downward. But if they can meet even their modest projections, then we can have faith that Marvel is moving back up and that they just hit a bit of a rough spot. I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Thank you for watching.